somebody says something to you and asks you like, hey, like, why'd you make this decision? And you're like, actually, I didn't have to make that decision and I could have made a better one. And once I make that better decision, there's a whole world of opportunity there sitting beneath the surface that, it's like a gold mine, but you're standing on top of dirt and you can't see it right beneath your feet.
Hello, Stellar community. Welcome to episode 14 of the Stellar Podcast. Today we are joined by Jove, a member of SDF's core team. Core, for those who may be unfamiliar, is the counterpart to Horizon. This is where all of the consensus happens. It's a C++ program that allows the nodes of the Stellar network to share this common ledger, ratify changes to it. It's the core of Stellar, that's why it's called that. And then most of the rest of us work with Horizon, right? So that's the ingested version of core, taking the XDRs and decoding those into a JSON format. But behind the scenes, behind Horizon, there's this core program, which I don't necessarily understand all that well. So very excited to talk to John today and get a better sense of what goes into making this thing work. To get things started though, we'll just start with a little bit of background. Maybe, John, if you can cover a little bit of your history, how you became a core Stellar developer. I assume you were born somewhere, started out as an infant child, just like myself, but here you are, years later, as a core developer. How in the world did that happen?
Yeah. So, common misconception. I actually wasn't born. No, I'm kidding. I was. Just like everybody here, I hope. And sometimes when I think about it, I feel like I've been programming since then. I've been programming since I was 10 years old and a little bit. My brother was programming, my older brother, when he was in high school. And when you're little, you always want to do what your brother's doing, do what your sister's doing, whatever. And so, I had him teach me a bit. And, in a while, the student had surpassed the teacher. Literally, my brother's a teacher nowadays. When I joined SDF, I really didn't know anything about blockchain. I'd be lying if I said I did. My previous career, my previous job was I was a quantitative trader. That's what I used to do. And so when I joined SDF, it was kind of like, I'm looking for something new to do. I want to do something where I can write software that people are actually going to use. And it'd be great if it was something financial because I'm familiar with it. And so, I was just looking around, looking for a job where I could be a C++ engineer doing that, and came across the SDF. And, I met Jed and David, and I thought that this was going to be a really good experience for me. And it really turned out to be the right job. So I've been really happy doing this.
That's super interesting. I too have an older brother who's a programmer, but he also was a musician, sort of, I guess. He played guitar, and I thought that was cool, and he told me I should play banjo. So that's how I followed my brother. I played banjo, which was a terrible decision. It's hard to make money as a banjo player. And if anyone ever asks me to play banjo, I will say no. But what is that like, trying to synchronize with something as important as core? Do you guys have a very specific workflow? How do you break up the core work? Is it broken up by cap? How does that work?
So there's a lot of different work going on core, and this is kind of a benefit for having a kind of small team. Stellar Core is it's a big piece of software. It has a lot of parts that are pretty clearly separated. There's the part that, the SCP module that actually runs consensus, and there's the overlay module that runs the network. And, there's the transaction processing system, which is where most, when you talk about a cap, you're probably making changes there. And there's other parts too. There's the data layer that actually, talks to the database and makes sure that we have the right data that we're pulling up and writing back, and I'm not going to say that these are completely independent systems, but they're pretty separated. And this is kind of a boon because, I can work on something like lately I've been working on this implementation for a different cap, cap 15, which is, I don't think it's the topic of today, but it's about fee bumps. And, we've been working on doing this correctly for a long time. And, I can just work on it and work on it and work on it and make changes and changes and changes and changes as we're refining the implementation and, and sorting everything out. And I'm not really likely to conflict with anybody or block anybody or anything like that.
So let's talk a little bit about what a cap is. So we've talked about SEPs before on this show, the Stellar Ecosystem Proposals, but maybe we can talk a little bit about a core advancement proposal. That's what a cap is, right?
You've got it.
All right. So what is a cap? How does it differ from a SEP? And ultimately, what is the purpose of having that differentiation?
So at its core, a cap is it's a protocol level change to Stellar Core. You could think of Stellar Core as having two kinds of parts. It has parts that are just implementation. And this is like, for example, the data layer. It doesn't matter how you write the data layer. As long as you talk to the database and pull in the right data, you're good to go. You can design it in any way you want, as long as it has that property. On the other hand, a protocol level change is something like what happens when you send a payment. Every single node in the network has to do it the exact same way. Nobody can disagree. Caps are in this domain. So, when we make a change to one of the subsystems and it's not a protocol level change, we don't write a cap. We just think about it as like a pure engineering problem. How can we make the implementation better? When we're writing a cap, there's a lot more that goes into it. Part of it is the commitment that you can't easily change it. Stellar Core contains in it the history of every version of the protocol. And so all the code to run the old protocol versions is in there too. So you don't really ever get to go backwards in the sense that like, oh, I want to remove this change. All you get to do is change it again. So when we're making a protocol change, we're really focused on getting the best possible properties that we can in the most surgical way possible.
That's a good description. What are some of the reasonings behind making a change? Like Stellar exists, isn't it perfect? Why don't we just leave it alone? You can all go home. You don't have to do any more work. Why do we need caps?
So Stellar is great, but I wouldn't say it's perfect. So for me, the first question is, does this need to be a cap? And that sounds like a stupid question. It's like, I suggested a cap. Does it need to be a cap? Well, I already suggested it, so maybe it should be. But it's actually a kind of profound question. You're basically asking the question, do we need to fix this in Stellar Core? Or can we fix this by building on top of Stellar Core? That's the difference between a cap and a SEP. And when you're building a SEP, what you're kind of saying is like, I want some people who I associate with to do this in a standardized way. When you're building a cap, what you're saying is everybody, without exception, has to work this way. That's the only possible way to do this. This is a hugely more impactful change. You can ignore a SEP. You cannot ignore a cap.
That's a good way to put it. Because it's the difference between the interoperability between like service providers. So if it's a wallet, you might have a wallet implementation and you want all wallets to operate like you. But if you enforce everyone who's building on top of Stellar to operate like a wallet, is that what we want Stellar to be? Or is that just what we want Stellar wallets to be like? And that is what are some of the guiding principles behind making that decision between a SEP and a cap? When is it SEP time?
So for me, one of the most compelling things that would convince me to write a cap would be, we tried to do this as a SEP and it didn't work. That's a very compelling argument. Because then it's like, okay, I saw what you did, I can see what happened, and it's not the desired goal, so we need to do something stronger. Another thing that would convince me is if you can show me that it can't possibly be done without a cap. This is a harder ask. You need to know a lot about the protocol to know that something cannot possibly be done, because lots of things that seem like they might be impossible, you can actually build out of the different components that we've put into the protocol.
Do you have an example of anything like that?
Yeah, so Stellar Core, the Stellar protocol, it doesn't have any native mechanism for options. But if I want to write an option, I can write something that looks just like an option using pre-signed transactions or pre-authorized transactions for that matter, depending on what I'm trying to achieve. And so there's nothing built into the protocol that says, there isn't a make option operation, but that doesn't mean that you can't build something yourself that looks just like an option. That would be something that if you suggested that you wanted to have options built into the protocol, I would respond, well, you can already do this. So why isn't the existing solution satisfactory to you? Have you tried? And if you can then show me like, oh, well, it doesn't have the following properties that I would require, or it's deficient in this manner, then we can talk about like, oh, actually the protocol isn't good enough, versus like, oh, like you just didn't realize that there were these components that you could combine in this clever way.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way to put it too. Because there's a lot of Stellar is built for something, and the documentation might point to a specific use case, but you can get away with a whole lot of finagling if you're clever about it, with pre-signed transactions, with time bounds, with pre-authorized transactions as signers. There's all kinds of interesting ways you can get to the goal that you might have, not in a less than obvious way, I guess. And that just requires some more deep thinking around the functionality that exists, and thinking about it less in terms of what we say you should do with it and more around what actually happens when you do it, because that functionality you could twist to be exactly what you want, even if it wasn't what it was designed, or the words we use to describe it. The words that we use to describe it ultimately don't matter. It's what it actually does that matters, and that might allow much more freedom to accomplish the business goals that you might have.
So you hit on a lot of the things that I think about when we're doing these engineering decisions. For me, when we're making decisions about a cap, there's a lot of vision and mission that goes into it. Every cap has a section like what Stellar network goals are you serving by doing this, and that's right at the top. You by the time you've written like 100 words, you've probably had to address that question. Mm-hmm. So we are really internalizing that we are making decisions that are about the mission, about the vision, and they have a big impact on what architecture people will need, what architecture we need in Stellar Core, and we never stop thinking about that. So a lot of times these questions come into usability. If you have a feature but it's not really that usable, do you have the feature at all? Well, if making it more usable would serve the mission, then we might make a cap to facilitate that. That's actually a lot of what Cap 23 is about. Making something that you can already do, but with great pain, into something that you can do easily, that you don't need to write gigantic flow diagrams out to try to understand, like, okay, like, what state am I in? Oh, no, if I transition to this state, I'm going to have a problem. No, nobody wants to do that. That's not usable. So we are thinking about these kinds of questions a lot.
I think that's a lot of the, maybe not quite as a danger deep level. That's what a lot of the SEP process is as well. But it's that much more important when you're at a core level of like, this is going to impact every single entity that is trying to build on Stellar, and is that something we want? Is that something that we want for the whole ecosystem? When you are looking at caps and caps are coming in, how I like a lot of the cap discussion happens on the Google developer email list. How do you view community involvement in the cap discussion? Is it essential? Is it semi-helpful? Is it core to the formation of this thing? How do you view community involvement in the cap discussions? How is it building up what that cap is becoming?
To me, the community involvement, that's essential. in an ideal world, we'd have more of it. But I think the fact that we don't is kind of our fault, my fault for not talking about it enough. That's why we're here talking about it. Um, but when we're making a cap, there are two questions. We try to be as backward compatible as possible. But normally when you change something, you might make things globally much better, but you might make some things slightly worse. Can we accept to make something slightly worse? Well, community feedback helps a lot to know, like, oh no, we depend on that working this way. You can't change it. So that's one thing. But also, we want to know that we're doing things that are impactful. You know, there's lots of interesting theoretical ideas that I have. I spend a lot of time thinking about the protocol, and from time to time, I come up with interesting concepts that they never make it to caps because while they're interesting, they're useful conceptually. Nobody's asking for them. They're not going to move the needle today. So one example of the way that we get community involvement, actually, other than just on the mailing list, we actually have held these working groups as we've developed these caps, and that has been very helpful. And I think as we do it more, it'll become more helpful as people become more familiar with what it means to sit down and really dive into the exact technical specifications of a proposal. What are the implications? Is it right? But we've done this a few times. A bunch of people have joined me for these, and it's been really cool.
That's neat. Y'all just get like in a Google chat and hash it out?
Yeah, exactly.
That's cool. Yeah, that's neat. And I think I agree 100% that having community, like not just having random people talking about these things, but people that are, their money is invested, like their business is invested in the decisions that are being made, what otherwise would be behind the scenes, to get this feedback loop of, would this be helpful? How would this change? So that you can get ahead of the curve a little bit, but also make an impact in the decisions that are made, so that the thing that gets updated, the changes that are made, you're not just aware of, but you helped form in a way that you understand the global scope of this thing and how it's maybe a little bit worse for you, but it helps 300 other companies, or you'll understand how that change will affect your business and how there may be new functionalities that are opened up to you, or you may have to change some code, but ultimately it'll be more performant. You understand and have a voice in those things. It makes those changes much easier to consume. And I think, again, that perspective is so important to have, particularly in the CAP process, because like you already mentioned, SEPs are a little bit more fluid. They can be updated, they can be changed, they can eventually become CAPs if they're not successful. So there's a little bit more fluidity there to say, let's try something that will help make the network more interoperable for this particular type of entity, this type of project that's being built on Stellar, like for wallets or exchanges or what have you. So there is a little bit more specificity I think you can have within a SEP that starts to explore how can we make this thing interoperable between specific entities. But when you're doing something in CAP, you are addressing the entire ecosystem. And so there has to be a lot more care put into what's the mission of STF, like what is Stellar trying to do, and is any proposal lining up with that? And at the most, like you said, like the smallest level, and then building that out, because the smallest level still might be something really big. Like you're trying to accomplish something, and if your small thing just added something that didn't accomplish the goal that you initially had, then it shouldn't be included no matter how small it is. But if that thing kind of grows to be something a little bit larger that does include some new operations, or even some breaking changes where there are going to need to be major updates, like that still is the smallest version of the thing that we have agreed is important enough to warrant the friction that will be caused by including this as an update. But it still is the smallest version of that thing. But you are always considering what's the mission of the whole network, not just a specific sector, which is maybe how a SEP would differ from a CAP. All right. Well, John, thanks so much for jumping in. We're going to cut it off here. We'll jump in next week for CAP 23. But thanks so much for the discussion so far. It's been fascinating, and look forward to digging in a little deeper into a specific CAP and how some of these thought processes make their way into a specific CAP. For more information about Stellar and the future of decentralized finance, visit stellar.org. And get involved in the discussion in one of our active communities on Keybase at stellar.public or Stellar Stack Exchange. Until next time, I'm your host, Tyler Vanderhoeven. We'll catch y'all later.